If any of you worry there's no space up the front, there's plenty. Feel free to move. So my name's Ian. I'm a developer advocate with Google+, and I'm going to talk today a little bit about using authentication systems from multiple providers in your code without having it turn into a giant ball of hay that you don't want to deal with. Hopefully, over the last sort of day and a half, you've seen some things about SignIn in general, maybe Tim Bray's identity talk yesterday. And you'll know that SignIn is difficult. It's very easy to make a fragile implementation of identity, of passwords, of dealing with account recovery, things like two-factor auth. It's complicated. And it's nice that you can defer that. You can hand that off to some other party who's got the engineering, who's got the privacy and the security teams to look after it. So I think social authentication is a good thing. I think third-party identity providers are a good thing. But it doesn't necessarily follow that it's a good thing to have multiple providers on, right? You could easily get into a situation where you have hundreds of buttons and no one wants to deal with it. But I think it is worth considering adding more than one identity provider to your application. And I think there's a reason that is good for you, and there's a reason that is good for the users. For the users, it gives them choice. And that choice is valuable. That choice allows them to choose the one they're most familiar with, choose the one that works for them. But it also allows them to express a facet of their personality. We don't all use the internet in the same way, and we don't all use every service in the same way. I have certain friends on certain sites and certain networks and certain interests that I post there. If I can sign into your app with the network that most closely aligns to my interest, I can express myself more accurately. As a developer, the big gain is that these days, identity providers don't just provide identity, they provide services. And you get access to those APIs for users as well. So it's valuable even if you have a user who is connected to connect an extra network, to have ways of getting into additional systems so that you can enhance your application, so that you can add more services, so that you can do things which are a bit more interesting. Now, adding an identity provider isn't actually that hard. I mean, if you just went out and tried to implement Google+ SignIn or Facebook or Twitter or LinkedIn or whoever, you get it done in a reasonably short time. It's somewhere between days and a few weeks. But it's very, very easy to spread knowledge of how a user is created throughout your system and end up in a case where changing it then becomes tricky. When there's an API change, when there is a newer version of something, it becomes complicated to do so. It becomes complicated to think about it. So what I think we need to think about when we're talking about multiple providers is roughly these four things. We have to think about how the user is authorized and authenticated. We have to think about what are the capabilities of the various systems we're integrating with, what's shared and what's different, what's special. We have to think about the data model on our side, and we have to think about the story from the user side. I'm not saying the user interface or the user experience. Those are things which have been covered elsewhere and are well worth spending time on. But I mean, why does the user sign in? What is the mechanism they are using? Why are they going to go and press this button? What do they get out of it? Telling that story is an important part of it, and having a feel for what signing in means in your application. So when I say authorization, I mean OAuth. OAuth is the dominant pattern for authorizing access to services online, on the web at least. And OAuth is very, very well established. OAuth2, standardized, lots of good implementations. Most providers now are working with OAuth2. There are some with OAuth1, Twitter I think is a notable example, but mostly it's moved to OAuth2. But OAuth is like giving the keys to your house to a real estate agent to show people around. Those people can come to your house, they can see what's there, but they don't know who you are. They just have access. So on top of OAuth, we need to layer a service to give us identity. And in fact, there's standardization happening in that area as well. From the OpenID group, there's OpenID Connect, which is adding standardized identity services which you can call with OAuth authorization. And we're involved in it, Facebook are involved in it. A lot of the big systems are moving that way. And I think that combination of OAuth2 and OpenID Connect is very, very interesting. There's a lot of very valuable and powerful concepts that come out of it. And you'll see those spread through more of the more recent systems and services. But if you've done OAuth2 before, you might think of a flow something like this. There's an app, it generates a URL, user clicks on the URL, goes to the provider, authenticates, comes back, sends a code to the application then exchanges it with the identity provider. Straightforward, right? And this is well covered by libraries. There's tons of libraries out here who'll do OAuth exchange for you. But even on the web, it's not this simple. If you look at more modern implementations like Google Plus sign-in, like Facebook's client-side sign-in, you'll see they don't actually redirect the user. They spin up an iframe, and in the iframe, the user communicates directly with the identity provider. And then they communicate with that iframe via the HTML5 post message API. That's really cool. It's faster. You get bidirectional origin verification. You get an ability to do things like seamlessly sign the user in when they visit a site. We like those things, but it means this flow isn't quite right. On mobile, it's even worse. On mobile, we have the same flow maybe, but how we actually deal with that varies. Perhaps we'd want to bring a browser up in the application. That could be a web view in Android or a UI web view in iOS. We'll have that flow and that will work, but that's a terrible experience for the users. They definitely don't have a cookie, so they're going to have to type in their username and password. And when they do that, they can't see where they're typing it into. They can't see the URL bar. They can't check the certificate. So maybe it's better to send them to the system browser. They may have cookies there, that's great. And they can check the certificate, they can see where they are. And that helps, it's a better experience, but the user can still kind of decide to go and do something else. So in a lot of cases, it's actually nicer to authenticate via another application. If you try and sign in on iOS with Google+, we'll actually take you to the Google+ iOS app. And you'll sign in there. And that's great, because we have a nice, fast consent screen. You're pretty much guaranteed to be signed in to the actual application. And there's no other navigation. You're not going to go off and look at a bookmark bar or something like that. And of course, you could have the actual authentication in the device itself. And that's something like the account manager on Android or the social framework on iOS, where the accounts live with the device. And all of these complicate how we implement even a straightforward flow. So what we're trying to get to is something like this. People don't use your app to sign in. They sign in to use your app. They sign in to get the value out of your app. And that's all happening up in the controllers in a standard sort of MVC pattern. The controllers and the views. It's the UI, it's the UX, it's the logic of what it's doing. You don't want to be thinking in there about how your user came to be, about the process of identification. You just want to think about what you can do with the user. So what we want is for that user to be generic, well, specific to your app, but generic to the provider and useful. Down here, though, is where the actual user is generated. That happens in the identity providers. You know they're going to have to actually sign in there. And we don't want that leaking all the way into the controllers, so we need to put some layer in between. And that's the idea that really underpins everything I'm going to talk about. If you take one thing away, just take that away. Try and separate the provisioning of identity from the usage of the user that has been identified. So I've got some code examples in here, and don't worry if you wonder, you want to note some things or take photos. All of the slides will be online afterwards. The video for this talk will be on YouTube. And there is code in here. I've got a bit of PHP for the web, a bit of Java for Android, and a bit of Objective-C for iOS. But little sample apps will all be up on GitHub afterwards. So don't feel like you have to follow every line. But this is kind of what we want to be able to do. We want to be able to just get a user. If I got a user, no. If I don't, redirect them. If I do use them, I just get the name, I activate it. I don't have to think about how this user came to be, I just have to use it. So to do that, we need to mediate access to these things. Down this side is roughly the user's flow if they're not logged in. They'll come to some part of your application where they need to be logged in. They'll be redirected to a login controller to choose their sign-in provider. Then something will happen, depending on the provider, and eventually they'll come back to the callback, where they will be given back that code, they will be given back some kind of token, and we will need to bring that back into the application and sign them in. In between, we have this authenticator, and the authenticator is handling all of the identity stuff for the vast majority of our app. In our sample apps, there's probably more identity code than anything else, but in reality, the vast majority of your code should be business code, should be doing what you want it to do. So we can get the user from here. We can list the providers so that we can create the sign-in options for them. We can take the response from the outside world and route it to the appropriate provider. And in all of these cases, we don't want to have to know which each provider is, what they're doing, how they work. We want it to be hidden. So we need an interface. We need to separate the generic parts of going through a sign-in process, checking whether the user is authenticated, signing them in, verifying that response to make sure they're the user we expect. And we need to provide a user. So at the heart of it, if we can't provide a user, we're not doing anything useful. But then for each individual provider, we need to implement a specific strategy of how to go and do those things for this provider. So we have an interface, right? It's how we decompose things in an OO system. We have an interface which defines exactly that thing. These are the functions. Now, this is PHP, and it's the web, and it's a slightly noddy demo example, so I'm just getting a markup and getting script to actually do the request. You might prefer to get a URL, or to return an object, or to return a reference to a template. There's 100 different ways of doing it, but the general idea is you're going to need something that will initiate the process. And that's what that does in this example. So even for a nice standards-compliant OAuth2 implementation like GitHub, there's things that are specific. GitHub have a certain way of dealing with redirect URIs. That's not necessarily the same way every other provider does, so we need to take that into consideration. They also have their own URLs for getting a token in the OAuth flow. They have their own URLs for exchanging, for sending the user to, so that they can actually sign in. And we want to encapsulate all that. So we have logic like this. This is just going to create a token to avoid CSRF attacks, put that into a URL along with our client ID, our identifier of which application we are with GitHub, our state value there, and the URL we'd like users to be redirected to afterwards. All of this is private. All of this stays inside our GitHub class. The external surface area is getting markup, and in this case, we're just going to return a button. It's a thing someone can click. It's not complex. We just get that URL, whack it into some HTML, someone clicks it, fine. When they've done that, they're going to go away to GitHub. They'll approve this access, hopefully. And when they come back, they're going to come back with a code. That code is going to be sent to our Authenticator. Our Authenticator is going to work out which provider it needs to go to and send it to that. And at that point, we need to verify it. So in this case, we're going to do a token exchange, and we're going to look at the results of that, of the token that comes back. So we take the short-lived code we're given, we send it off to GitHub, we get back an access token, and we can look at that and see what we can do with it. For example, we can go and get the user's profile, so we know their name, we know who they are. If we do this with Google+, we probably want to do it a little bit differently. In Google+, we'd like to use this nice JavaScript post-message flow. So the markup isn't a link, it's this tag, which has the gSignIn class on it. And that's going to generate a button, that's going to trigger a JavaScript callback once they click it, and then we can send the response of that callback back to our server. So in this case, the user isn't getting redirected, we're handling that through JavaScript, but the same end result kind of happens. Some information comes back to our server, and we need to validate it. So we can send it through to our validate function, which looks a bit like this. Same idea, exchange token, get the user's profile. In this case, we can use the Google PHP API client library to do that for us. But in either case, we don't have to care. We've done that, we've got that information, we can generate a user and return it, and our controller code just deals with the user, doesn't have to think about how that user came to be. But in our little example, I was just getting the name, and the name's not very interesting. We want to do more interesting things with the APIs we've exposed by signing in with the provider. And that's tricky, because when we're doing that, we need to think about what specific functionality each provider provides. There's very little that is shared between everyone you could sign in with. All we need to do, though, is to think about what we're trying to do rather than how we're actually doing it. If you imagine you had a section on a site that had a kind of recommended for you, and there was a provider that returned an interest list, and that was a list of entries in a database, in some graph database somewhere that said what you were interested in, or a list of entities that you were interested in. And you were extracting tags out of that and using those tags to look up content in your database. If you model it mentally as, I get that information from there, you're limited. You can only do it with them. If you think about, I just need a list of tags, then you can do it a number of different ways. You could get those tags by looking at a bookmarking site. You could get it from posts or hashtags on a social networking site. You could go and look at someone's YouTube watch history. Once you think about it in terms of the feature you're actually trying to provide, you then have the flexibility to implement it different ways with different providers. It's the same idea of separating an abstraction there and not leaking the details of that provider through to your application. So that means we need to represent the user. And we do that, again, with an interface, because each of these providers is going to return their own concrete user object, which provides this interface. So we've got the name, we've got the provider ID, we've got whether they can do a certain feature, and we've got sign out and disconnect, so we can obey the various rules for various networks on what options should be given to users. But you'll note that we've made a decision here, which is a little bit subtle, in that this user has a provider and a ID. Just the one. We've made the decision that what's happening here is you are signing in, not signing up. And both models are common. When you sign in, there is a one-to-one mapping between an identity provider account and an application account. When you sign up, there is a many-to-one mapping between identity providers and a single app account. So each case is valid. Each case is a reasonable thing. I can sign in with GitHub and be me, and sign in as Google Plus and be me, or I can sign in with those two networks and be two different users on the system. It depends on what you're doing, and communicating this is part of what the user story is, making them understand what's valuable for them. But who is the user anyway? What are we actually storing? What are we actually working with? A lot of the time when people implement a provider, they take the ID and they stick it in the database column, and they're done. And that's bad, because when you do that, you've coupled yourself to that provider. As soon as you add another one, that ID is no longer enough information. You need to always store a tuple, a pair of the provider and the provider user ID. So in this case, this is Google and my Google ID, Facebook, my Facebook ID, LinkedIn and my LinkedIn ID. Those are all identifiers, and I can have multiple of those referring to the same app user if I want to. And this is why things like upgrade are not a problem. If you already had an OAuth2 login and you wanted to go to Google Plus sign-in, it's not a problem, because the provider is still Google. The user ID is still that user ID. It's just a different way of getting there. And thinking about it that way means that you don't have to worry about the exact strategy being used to sign a user in. If you use a completely different system on mobile than you do on a web, as long as it results in that pair, you know it's the same user. And that's great. Now, the other thing people look at is email. And email is often used to combine accounts, which feels like a good thing, but it's tricky. When you have an email address, you have some knowledge about that user. That user probably had that email address. Most providers will do some verification, but the verification is likely to be point in time. So at some point, the identity provider sent an email to that address, the user clicked the email. They had that address then. But particularly with corporate email, with email on free providers, sometimes things get reused. Sometimes email belongs to a different person. But it doesn't mean that all the other identities that have been associated with that email get invalidated. So it can be a little risky at times to rely on email. The OpenID Connect spec actually says, do not assume email to be a unique identifier. It is totally fine for an identity provider to return an email address, the same email address for two different accounts. You should always look for that ID and that provider identification. That's the most reliable way of dealing with it. But the way of having multiple accounts is nice. So the Android code that is in the GitHub repo, the sort of sample we're working with, that has this basic idea. You can sign in, and there's a bunch of features, pretty much the same as PHP. And when you sign in, we enable the features that go with that network. But at this point, we've created an app account as well. That's why it can say, thank you for using our app, because it knows I'm new. I have local state to go with my identity provider state. And that means I can attach other identity providers as well, and then I get more features available to me because those providers provide additional features. And this pattern is very, very common in the real world. This is TuneIn Radio, The Fancy, and Banjo, all who implement pretty much this structure. And you'll see it in many, many apps. All of them allowing you to map multiple identity providers to a single user account. And that means you need to think about how the data is structured differently. You can't think about one table of a user. You have to have a separation between the identity provider and the user, and it's many-to-one. This is good though, because once you have this second table that has the provider user ID, you can then key data against it. So if you retrieve some information, you can put it into another table keyed against the provider user ID, which means if you need to disconnect a user and you have to follow data deletion rules, it's easy. You just look up everything attached to that ID. If you have to expire a cache after a certain amount of time, then it's easy. You just look up everything connected to that ID. So having this separation makes it easier to structure your applications and structure the data retrieved from your applications and the provenance of that data. So to do this, we're going to do things a little bit differently. We've still got the same basic model. We've got our authenticator layer in the middle, though in this case it's going to be a fragment. We've got our providers, which are going to be fairly dumb. And we've got our activity. But we know that our providers are going to want to hold a little bit more state. We'd like our providers to be able to be signed in so that when you go in and attach them, if you've already authenticated with that app in that device, it's quick. It's a quick thing to do. So it speeds the process for the user. And we know we're going to have to pass around some information. Activity results are going to have to flow all the way back from the outside world, if it's going out to the system browser, back in to our provider. But it's roughly the same idea. We're sending information back to be verified, and when we're done, we send the user back. But there's an extra complication in it. In this middle layer, we don't just send the user straight back. It's the same as in PHP. We have a user created in our provider, but we don't just send it straight back out to our main activity. Instead, we have this account user concept because we need to be able to deal with those cases. We need to be able to go, does this identity provider user map to an account user? Does it map to an account user when one is already signed in? Is it the same user? We need to consider that state before we return anything. And we won't return anything until we've resolved it into a central, reliable application user. So it's pretty straightforward for our activities. They get to do things like this. They get a callback, they can get the name, they can test the features, they can see if the user's new. Simple. They don't have to do much at all. And our sign-in user, however, has to do a lot more work. Rather than just being an interface, it's now a concrete object because it needs to carry with it information. It needs to carry with it the provider data for all of the providers that are attached. Previously, that was kind of built in. If you had a Google user, that Google user came with that data. In this case, we want to attach Google data or LinkedIn data or Facebook data into the same object. And we need access to a database. Now, in this case, this is just a local SQLite. In reality, you'd probably be using sync down to a web service somewhere or other kind of communication, and your user store would be on a server. But the basic concept is similar. You're going to have this representation of a user stored away in a database. So to add a provider, all we need to do is put their information into that hash we defined earlier, and then if the user ID is null, and that ID, that MID, is the account user ID, is the app user ID. It's not a provider one. That's why there's just an ID, no matching provider. If it's null, we're going to then go and retrieve a user ID. Say, has this user signed in with this provider? If they have, great. We know who this is. We can go with it. If they haven't, we can create a user. And that's when we can set the isNew flag. We know we've had to build a user for this. And all that's doing is just inserts and reads on those database tables. And then it's easy. Dealing with things like features, all the features is just a set of features provided by each connected provider. So we just loop over the providers we have in our object, and we can test them to see, do you provide this feature? If you do, I'm good to go. Very simple for our object. And note, it doesn't have to know anything about who these providers are. The user never has to care about who the providers are. They just follow the interface. So you don't have to leak that provider-specific code into anywhere else in your application. But the provider-specific code gets to be relatively straightforward as well. You don't have to do too much with it, because it doesn't have to carry much more than just its general state. So when we want to attempt to sign in to see if we've got a connection using Facebook, we can just use the OpenActiveSession call with allow login UI set to false. That's that middle parameter there. And that means we'll try and see whether we have a valid Facebook session running. If we do, cool. We've gotten a user account ready to go. So if the user taps on us, we can immediately serve it. If not, fine, we'll just leave it. In the sign-in, though, where a user action has been requested, we'll make the same call, but with that allow login UI set to true. So we'll actively go and make a call. We'll actively present dialogue to the users for them to sign in with. It's precisely the same with Google+. When we go in, we have a connect call. That's going to connect to Google Play Services. That's where our authentication is kind of being held. We go to Google Play Services, we see whether we're signed in. If we're not, we're going to get a callback with an error. And that error can be resolved into an intent, which will display some dialogue to the user. So we just won't do that. When the user signs in, we know they've taken an action, so we can display that dialogue to them and let them sign in and let them authenticate with us. So that's fine. And most of the time, we're in a really easy state. The user goes to the chooser page, taps the sign in, an account is created or locked up, and there we are. We have an identity provider and an app account. You come back another day or another user comes in, identity provider account, app account, great. But sometimes you've got this situation and then the top user signs in with the same identity provider account, which now maps to a second app account. We've now got a conflict. And what we do with that depends on the application and what you want to do with it. Most of the time, you can go, these users don't conflict. We can just merge them. Whether that's something the user would be involved with or not, that's up to you. But you know they've signed in. You know they have authenticated on both these systems. So they have access. So you can choose to merge it if you want. And that's roughly what we do here. We just present a dialogue to the user. Hey, this user already exists, but we can have those mapped to the same app account if you want. Do you want to merge or do you want to switch? Because maybe you just like to be this other user right now. We can give them that option. But sometimes we can't. It's easy to think of cases, but there's likely to be more app-specific cases in your application where there are things between accounts that don't allow them to be merged well. In this case, imagine there was a third identity provider connected, and on that third identity provider, 2 different users were signed in. In that case, we couldn't combine them. We can't merge those accounts automatically, but we can still prompt the user. They've done a legitimate action by signing in with another provider. They genuinely have access to that. We just can't fix the situation for them. So we can just say to them, hey, do you want to switch? Or just cancel, stay where you are. And all of that is mediated by this authenticator. All of that is mediated in the fragment, in this middle layer, without needing to know about the provider. We can go in, we can see, is the user ID null? If it is, we just take that user, whatever's been given to us by a provider. If it isn't null, then is it the same as the user that's come in? So I've signed in with Google+, I've signed in with Facebook, both look up to the same app user, it just connects the accounts, it doesn't have to do anything. If that's not true, then can I merge the users? What logic is required to test that? That logic doesn't have to involve knowing anything about who the providers are. It can just be testing, is there a conflict between these 2 sets of providers? And it can be doing application-specific information. But again, we don't have to look into the provider to see how to do this. So I wanted to give you one other way of looking at this kind of problem, which is the idea that having state for the identity provider user separate than having application state is kind of beneficial. And you can use that to handle a whole bunch of applications. So you might think of a TV guide that lives on a tablet app. A TV guide, different family members want to see their chosen shows. But they don't, it's not secret, right? They just don't want to see the other person's. They want to be able to switch. So that means it's an identity problem. You need to know who they are. But you don't really care about separating that data too much. You just want to make sure they only see the stuff they want to see. So you can build something like this. This is in iOS, and we've just got our screen. It's anonymous. You can tap Choose Account. When you choose account, you get a list of attached accounts. In this case, there's my Facebook account, a Twitter account, and Google Plus isn't signed in. So I tap Google Plus, and then I sign in. I go through the regular flow. So even though these two providers were signed in, that doesn't automatically sign me into the app. I have to choose. I have to go through an account chooser. Once I do it, I'm signed in and I can use the application as me. But if I want to change, I just hit Choose Account and can switch again. This is very much like the fast account switching in Gmail, in the Gmail app where you can choose what you're using it as. That's a really valuable model. And it brings home the point that identity doesn't have to be like this huge lock and key way of getting into systems. It can be anything that helps the user use your application, helps them get what they need out of it. So in this case, to keep it lightweight, rather than have the view controller know anything about our authentication layer in the middle, I thought, why not use a message bus? And in iOS, NS Notification Center is sort of standard way of doing it. On Android, you could use any event bus type library. Otto's Square is a good one. And in this case, the user might go to the account chooser. The account chooser will communicate with the providers. If the user taps on one of them, they just signal the authenticator, which puts a message onto the bus. And anyone that happens to be listening that wants to know about it knows. Very cheap, very easy switching. Subscribing is as simple as registering an observer of yourself with k-user status notification. That's just the message type you want to listen for. And check user is the function that should be called when a message comes in. And publishing is pretty much the same. So we don't have to know about what's going on between those two. And in this case, we need the identity provider to hold state. It has to know whether it's signed in, because that doesn't mean that we're signed into the app with that user. It just means they're available. So each of our identity providers, when you sign in, may already have a user. They can return it right away. You want to track that separately. And then, if the user isn't signed in, we can actually prompt some UI. We can bring something up. And in fact, this is from an example with Twitter. So with Twitter, we're using the built-in integration into the OS with the social framework in iOS 5 and 6. So we can go in, we can request from the account store accounts of type Twitter, see if we're granted access. If we are, we can retrieve that user. Now, we'll do that either way. We'll do that if we've started the app right away, and we'll do it when the user taps sign in. If we've started the app right away, and the user has previously granted access, and we retrieve a user, we won't do anything with it. We'll just keep it locally. And then when they sign in, we return it. If this is happening once they've tapped the button, we know it's a user action. So down here, we'll actually take that user and return it back to our object. But again, wrapped in an interface, wrapped in a way that means the actual view controller doesn't have to understand how that identity was provisioned. They just have to use it. Google Plus, pretty much the same thing. We return the user if we have it available. Otherwise, we just call the authenticate method on the shared instance of the GPP sign-in object. Very straightforward. And that will kick off the process for us. So I kind of hope that's given you some ideas about ways you can think about combining different providers. It doesn't have to be all or nothing, incredibly complex integration. It can be simple and lightweight, and you can just let users choose. And I hope it gives you some ideas about the benefits. I appreciate it is difficult. If you are doing a situation where you are merging multiple identity provider accounts onto a single app account, there are edge cases, there are conflicts, and you'll have to resolve those. And that will take time. But if done right, I do believe that it will not just give your users a better experience, it will actually help the structure of your applications. It'll help you provide a good system and a scalable system that is going to be flexible when demands come up for you to change it, for you to change versions, for you to upgrade, or to add new providers. So that's about it from me. We've got a few minutes for questions, but I'll be at the Google Plus sandbox on the second floor afterwards if you have any more. If you're interested in this kind of thing, Eric Sachs from our identity team wrote a really good document on running a login system with an account chooser. It's kind of web-centric, but the concepts and the ideas are fantastic, and it's really, really helpful if you want to think about this in more detail. If you're interested in Google Plus sign-in, all of the documentation is on developers.google.com /plus, and there's sessions on it today. We had Android earlier, iOS at the end of the day with XT and Silvano. We've got web with Ade up next in here, I think. And then there's a few other sessions on things like best practices and how to integrate throughout the day. All of the code from this talk, if you are interested in it, is on GitHub, or it will be as soon as I go and make the repo public. And that is at that URL. And that's about it for me. Thank you. Yeah, so questions. And as this gentleman has, if you could come to the mic if you have questions, just so that they're on the recording, that would be great.
Thanks, Ian. It was a very practical discussion. I really appreciate it. Yesterday in Tim Bray's talk in the morning, I saw something really interesting, something I didn't really think you could do. He logged into a demo app that he'd written in Ruby with Google+. Then he set a preference, logged out, and then logged into it again with Facebook, and it recognized that he was the same person both ways. And I'm kind of curious, do you know, can you give some practical advice on how to do stuff like that?
Tim's actually just over there. I don't know, how did you do it in your example?
Well, exactly what you said. Okay. There's a layer of abstraction in there that auto-merges these people when it detects they're the same person. Now, I confess that because this was a cheap demo app, I used an email address.
Yeah.
Okay. Which is bad.
Yeah, so yeah, Tim was just saying that it's exactly that kind of thing. He auto-merged people, and in that case, he used the email address as the key. But it's finding an identifier and using that to go back and forth. I think there's a lot of different ways you can do it. And though I might say email address is a problem in some cases, there are some cases where you don't actually care that much, right? If you just want a lightweight way and you're not that bothered if some other user gets access to it, it might be fine. Right. And there's loads of legitimate cases for that where you do want something a bit lighter. So it's always trade-offs. It's always what do you want to do, what the level of confidentiality and security and functionality you need to provide is. Oh.
Whereas it's a bad practice to rely on the email address, it's also probably not a good practice to ignore the case when you happen to get two that are the same. Mm-hmm. A very reasonable course of action might be something you suggested, which is to pop up a dialogue saying, oh, hey, you're just signing in as Tim Bray on Facebook, and I noticed you've been signing in as Tim Bray as Google for the last 3 weeks. Would you like to merge these? That's a very reasonable course of action. Yeah,
absolutely. I think that's a really good point. I think one of the subtleties that tends to come into it, which when you've got things like multiple sign-in, is what do you do when users kind of forget what they signed in with? And so that kind of case really helps. If you can go, you're a new user, but you look like this user. Are you really them? And then give them the option to merge. Luke Wrapup actually had a really interesting model he did where you could start typing in your email address and it would like show you which providers you've signed in with, which obviously could be a privacy leak. So it's something you have to think about whether that fits for your app, but it was a really nice idea where you could start typing things in and go, oh yeah, that's me. So that they hint which the user should use if you do have that situation. Cool. Is there any other questions? Otherwise, I think that's about it. Okay, thank you very much.